Student protests in the U.S. have long been a form of activism seeking to inspire change worldwide. Anti-Vietnam War protests in the 1960s inspired youth in Africa to create their own anti-war and anti-colonial movements. A student-driven protest in America against the conflict in Gaza gain attention. How will Africa's students respond? VOA's Anthony LaBruto explains.
It was university students who first soured public opinion of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s. While initially limited and deeply unpopular, the protests led to increasingly violent confrontations between students and police. Africa's young leaders, who had themselves recently declared independence from European colonial empires, were taking note of the protests and discontent. As products of revolutions, many saw Vietnam as a part of the same struggle for freedom. The beginnings of the Pan-Africanism movement, alongside decolonization, saw Africa's students following their liberated governments in declaring solidarity with Vietnam. Algeria and Tanzania, most notably, saw street protests directly praising their government's anti-colonial stances in Southeast Asia.
So that was absolutely an inspiration for a lot of African youth at that period of time, in a similar way that it was an inspiration to American youth. But Vietnam, as our work has demonstrated, was in no way a kind of marginal concern or a mere footnote in post-colonial African history. It was an important site of the struggle for decolonization for a lot of young African regimes.
Now, as many U.S. students call for an end to the Israel-Hamas war, African students are encouraging their governments to once again take action.
The South Africans pull their ambassador from Israel. Chad's done the same. So those kinds of expressions of, a global South solidarity with Palestine are also reminiscent to some degree of an earlier period of history. And then at the level of protest, recently there's been an encampment at the University of Wits in South Africa.
Melchiore says the length of the Vietnam War itself contributed to the prolonged discontent. While the war against Hamas is barely a year old, the way that students are uniting may indicate a broader social movement.
In the same way that the civil rights movement was an incredibly important precursor to what came to be the anti-war movement, I think that, we have to see the BLM protests as an important precursor to these kind of pro-Palestinian protests. And I think similarly, too, there was a way in which the Vietnam War came to be connected to so many of the concerns that a increasingly politicized younger generation of Americans had.
While U.S. college campus protests have largely ceased with the conclusion of the spring semester, university leaders are bracing for a potentially tumultuous fall semester should the war continue. Anthony LaBruto, VOA News, Washington.